June 25, 1944, 23:40 hours. Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber stood on the balcony of his command post, overlooking the beaches of Normandy, when something made him look up. The sound came first, not the usual drone of Allied reconnaissance aircraft, but something different, something massive. Weber raised his binoculars toward the darkening sky. What he saw made his blood freeze. The horizon was filling with aircraft, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The formation stretched as far as he could see in every direction, blotting out the stars. He grabbed the field telephone. His hand trembled as he turned the crank. The words came out barely above a whisper. "They are coming. All of them. The sky is full." This moment would mark the beginning of the largest airborne operation in history, an aerial armada so vast that soldiers on the ground would later swear the sky itself had turned black. What German defenders had feared for months was finally happening, and the scale exceeded their worst nightmares. The crisis had been building since 1943. German intelligence knew an invasion was inevitable. They knew it would come somewhere along the French coast. They knew the Allies were assembling massive forces in England. What they did not know was when, where, or how large the assault would be. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, defending the Atlantic coast, had spent months strengthening defenses, millions of mines planted on beaches, obstacles constructed in shallow water, artillery positions reinforced, infantry divisions repositioned. The fortifications were formidable, but Rommel understood something his superiors did not. The invasion would not be stopped on the beaches. It would be decided in the first hours. In a May 1944 letter to his wife, he wrote candidly about the challenge. "The enemy will have complete air superiority. Our movements will be restricted to nighttime. Reinforcements will struggle to reach the battle. Everything depends on the first day." German forces defending Normandy faced impossible odds. Allied air supremacy meant daylight movement invited destruction. The Luftwaffe had been shattered in the months prior. Fighter groups that once numbered hundreds of aircraft now struggled to field dozens. Experienced pilots were gone, replaced by undertrained newcomers who survived mere days in combat. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer reconnaissance battalion near Caen, described the situation in his diary. "We hear them every night, English and American aircraft flying overhead unopposed. We cannot move tanks in daylight without being spotted and attacked within minutes. We are blind while the enemy sees everything." The mathematics were brutal. Allied forces preparing for Operation Overlord included over 150,000 soldiers for the initial assault. Behind them waited millions more. The invasion fleet comprised over 5,000 vessels. Air support included more than 11,000 aircraft. Against this, Germany had positioned roughly 50,000 troops immediately defending the beaches, with another 100,000 within striking distance. But numbers alone did not tell the story. German defenders were scattered across hundreds of miles of coastline, unsure where the main attack would fall. The Allies, knowing exactly where they would strike, could concentrate overwhelming force at chosen points. The real German nightmare was not the naval bombardment or beach assault. It was what would come from the sky. Allied commanders had learned painful lessons from earlier amphibious operations. North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had taught them that seizing beachheads was only the beginning. The real battle came when defenders counterattacked with mobile reserves, particularly armored forces. If panzer divisions could reach the beaches quickly, they could crush the invasion before it gained momentum. The solution was audacious. Allied airborne forces would drop behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings. Their mission was not to capture territory permanently. Their mission was chaos. Disrupt communications, block roads, seize bridges, create confusion. Most critically, delay German reinforcements from reaching the coast. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, understood the risk. Airborne operations were inherently dangerous. Soldiers dropped into darkness over hostile territory, units scattered during drops, equipment often landed miles from intended zones. Casualties in airborne assaults typically ran high, but the alternative was worse. Without airborne forces disrupting German responses, panzer divisions could reach the beaches by noon on the first day. The invasion would face mobile armor before establishing defensive positions. The result would be catastrophic. On the evening of June 5th, the operation began. Over 1,200 transport aircraft and 700 gliders began loading at airfields across southern England. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop on the western flank of the invasion near Utah Beach. British 6th Airborne Division would drop on the eastern flank near Sword Beach. The total force exceeded 23,000 soldiers who would arrive by parachute or glider before dawn. Behind them would come additional waves throughout the day. The scale was unprecedented. Nothing in history compared. Captain Frank Lilliman, leading Pathfinder teams jumping first to mark drop zones, described the scene at the airfield. The aircraft stretched as far as you could see, hundreds of them lined up, engines warming, paratroopers loading. Every man knew many of us would not see tomorrow, but we also knew if we succeeded, we would win the battle before it even started. The aircraft took off beginning at 2245 hours. They formed up over England, then turned south toward France. The formations were massive. 9 aircraft wide stretched over 300 miles of sky. The sound of engines could be heard from 20 miles away. German radar operators detected the formations immediately, but they faced a problem. Allied aircraft had been flying over France for months. Bombing raids came almost nightly. Radar screens constantly showed dozens or hundreds of aircraft. This night seemed no different until the formations kept coming. And coming, and coming. Hauptmann Wilhelm Richter, duty officer at the German radar station near Cherbourg, watched his screen with growing alarm. At 2300 hours, he counted over 200 aircraft. By 2330 hours, the number exceeded 500. By midnight, he stopped counting. The formations filled his radar display completely. He picked up the telephone to headquarters. Something is happening. The entire sky is full of aircraft. This is not a normal bombing raid. I believe this is the invasion. The response was skeptical. Allied deception operations had been ongoing for months. False intelligence suggested attacks might come anywhere from Norway to southern France. Every alarm in recent weeks had proven false. Headquarters told Richter to monitor and report further developments. By 0030 per hours on June 6th, the first transport aircraft crossed the French coast. The Pathfinders jumped first, landing in darkness to mark drop zones with lights and radio beacons. 12 minutes later, the main force began jumping. What happened next was simultaneously chaotic and magnificent. Oberleutnant Weber stood frozen on his balcony as the sky above Normandy transformed. The sound was overwhelming, thousands of aircraft engines creating a roar that drowned out all other noise. Then came something he had never seen before. The sky began filling with parachutes. White canopies blossomed against the dark sky, like flowers appearing in fast motion. Hundreds of them, then thousands. They fell slowly, silently, as the aircraft roared overhead and continued inland. Weber watched paratroopers descending into fields, into trees, into marshes, into villages. He grabbed the telephone again and shouted over the engine noise. Airborne assault, massive scale. They are landing everywhere, thousands of them. His voice cracked. Request all available forces. This is the invasion. The response came quickly this time. Hold your position. Report all enemy movements. Reinforcements are being organized. But reinforcements would not come quickly, and that was exactly the point. The Allied airborne assault was designed to create maximum chaos. Drop zones intentionally overlapped with German defensive positions. Paratroopers landed in scattered patterns, making it impossible for defenders to know where to concentrate forces. Some units landed miles from intended zones, but this accident actually enhanced the chaos. German reports flooded in from dozens of locations simultaneously, painting a picture of airborne forces everywhere. Private Robert Murphy of the 101st Airborne described the experience years later. We jumped into complete darkness. I hit the ground hard in a field. I could not find anyone from my unit. I could hear gunfire in every direction. German voices shouting, American voices shouting, complete chaos. I was terrified but also exhilarated. We were doing it. We were actually invading France. The German response was hampered from the start. Communication lines had been sabotaged by French resistance fighters in the hours before. Many telephone connections were dead. Radio communication was jammed by Allied electronic countermeasures. Units could not reach headquarters. Headquarters could not reach higher command. Major von Luck, awakened by his staff at 0100 hours with reports of paratroopers landing, immediately understood the situation. This is the invasion. We need to move toward the coast immediately with all available forces. But he could not move. His orders were explicit. No unit was to move without direct authorization from higher command, and higher command could not be reached. The telephone lines were down, radio communication was intermittent. Von Luck and thousands of other German officers sat paralyzed, waiting for orders that would not come for hours. This paralysis was exactly what Allied planners had hoped for. Every hour German reinforcements sat idle was another hour for beach-landing forces to establish themselves ashore. The airborne troops did not need to stop German units permanently, they just needed to delay them. British paratroopers landing near the Orne River had specific objectives. Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge needed to be captured intact to allow Allied forces to advance inland after landing. Major John Howard led a glider assault directly onto the bridges. 6 gliders carrying 180 men landed within yards of their targets at 00:16 hours. The assault was swift and violent. German defenders were overwhelmed in minutes. The bridges were captured intact. Within an hour, engineers had removed demolition charges and prepared the bridges for Allied use. One of the first objectives of the entire invasion was complete before the sun rose. American paratroopers faced different challenges. Drop zones in the Cotentin Peninsula were partially flooded by German defensive measures. Many soldiers landed in marshes, some drowning under the weight of equipment in deep water. Units were scattered across miles of countryside. Company and battalion formations ceased to exist. Small groups of soldiers from different units found each other and formed ad hoc combat teams. But this improvisation worked. Small groups of paratroopers ranging from 5 to 50 men began attacking German positions throughout the region. They cut telephone lines, they ambushed patrols, they mined roads. They created the illusion of a force much larger than reality. Oberst Gunther Keil, commanding a regiment defending the area, received over 60 separate reports of enemy contact before dawn. His headquarters staff plotted the reports on a map. The pattern suggested Allied forces were landing across an area of over 100 square miles. He reported to division headquarters that he was facing at least 2 full divisions, possibly more. The actual Allied strength in his sector was less than 5,000 scattered paratroopers. But they were creating chaos far beyond their numbers. Dawn came to Normandy at 558 hours on June 6, 1944. As light spread across the landscape, German defenders could finally see what they faced. What they saw exceeded comprehension. The English Channel was covered with ships. From horizon to horizon, vessels of every size and type stretched as far as the eye could see. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, supply ships. Thousands of vessels in organized formations advancing toward the coast. Oberleutnant Weber stared at the armada through his binoculars. His hands no longer trembled. He had moved past fear into a strange calm acceptance. "There are so many ships I cannot count them," he said quietly to his aide. "We cannot stop this. No one could stop this." At 06:30 hours the naval bombardment began. Battleships and cruisers opened fire on coastal defenses. The sound was like continuous thunder. Shells weighing over 1,000 kilograms screamed overhead and exploded against fortifications. The ground shook constantly. Smoke and dust filled the air. German defenders crouched in bunkers and trenches, enduring the bombardment, waiting for the landing craft to approach. Some positions were destroyed outright. Others survived, but with defenders too stunned to fight effectively. The bombardment lasted for over an hour, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance on the coastal defenses. Then the landing craft began their run to shore. Hundreds of vessels carrying soldiers crossed the final miles of open water toward the beaches. The first waves hit the shore at 0630 hours on Utah Beach and 0635 hours on Omaha Beach. The battle for the beaches was fierce. German defenders, despite the bombardment, fought with determination. Machine gun positions opened fire. Artillery targeted landing craft. Mortars dropped rounds into clusters of advancing soldiers. The beaches became zones of intense combat. But the German response was disorganized. Communication between defensive positions had been severed by the bombardment. Commanders could not coordinate defensive fires. Reinforcements were still not arriving. The roads inland were blocked by paratroopers. The railroads were cut. Vehicle columns attempting to move in daylight were attacked by Allied aircraft. Major von Luck finally received permission to move his forces toward the coast at 900 hours. 3 critical hours had been lost. As his battalion began advancing, Allied fighter bombers appeared overhead. The first vehicles in his column exploded under rocket fire. He ordered his forces off the road into cover. They would not reach the coast until nightfall. This pattern repeated across Normandy. German reinforcements struggled to reach the fighting. Airborne forces had not stopped them permanently, but delays of 4, 6, 8 hours proved decisive. By the time reinforcements arrived, Allied forces had established beachheads and were expanding inland. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers who had trained for years to repel an invasion found themselves unable to execute their plans. The overwhelming Allied superiority in the air meant movement, invited destruction. The massive naval forces offshore meant coastal positions could be obliterated at will. The airborne forces behind the lines meant no position was safe. Gefreiter Klaus Hartmann, an infantry soldier defending near Omaha Beach, described the morning in his diary. "The sky is full of their aircraft. The sea is full of their ships. Paratroopers are behind us. We are surrounded by an enemy so numerous we cannot count them. We fight because we are soldiers, but we know we cannot win this battle." By noon on June 6th, Allied forces had landed over 156,000 soldiers across 5 beaches. Casualties were significant, particularly at Omaha Beach, where over 2,000 were lost. But the beachheads were secure. Reinforcements were flowing ashore. The invasion had succeeded. German commanders now faced an impossible situation. The Allies were ashore in force. Air superiority meant German movements were severely restricted. The Luftwaffe could not contest Allied air dominance. Panzer divisions that might have crushed the invasion in its first hours were still miles away, struggling to reach the fighting. Feldmarschall Rommel, who had been in Germany visiting his wife on the morning of June the 6th, rushed back to France. He arrived at his headquarters that evening and received the situation reports. After listening to the litany of disasters, he spoke quietly. "The battle is lost. We cannot drive them back into the sea. Our only hope now is to contain them while we build stronger defenses inland." The transformation from June 5th to June 7th was complete. 48 hours earlier, German forces had controlled Normandy confidently. Now they were fighting desperately to prevent complete collapse. The psychological shift was as important as the tactical situation. Allied air supremacy proved decisive. Over 11,000 aircraft supported the invasion on the first day alone. They flew over 14,000 sorties, providing reconnaissance, fighter cover, ground attack, and transport. The Luftwaffe flew fewer than 300 sorties. The numerical disparity was overwhelming, but the qualitative advantage made it decisive. German soldiers learned quickly that movement in daylight meant destruction. Vehicle columns were attacked within minutes of being spotted. Trains could not run. Reinforcements moved only at night, losing precious time. Supply lines were constantly disrupted. The Allied air forces had created a condition where German forces could not maneuver effectively. The airborne assault, despite heavy casualties and scattered drops, achieved its primary objective. German reinforcements were delayed by critical hours. Roads were blocked. Bridges were destroyed or captured. Communications were disrupted. The chaos created by 23,000 paratroopers multiplied their impact far beyond their actual strength. Allied casualties in the airborne operations were significant. Over 4,000 paratroopers and glider troops became casualties in the first day. Many units landed far from objectives. Equipment was lost or scattered. Communication between units was difficult. But the mission succeeded because delays to German responses provided the time needed for beach forces to establish themselves. By June 7th, Allied forces had landed over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies. The beachhead was secure and expanding. German counterattacks were piecemeal and ineffective. The battle for Normandy would continue for months, but the invasion itself had succeeded. General Eisenhower, in his June 6th diary entry, wrote about the decision to proceed despite uncertain weather. The airborne assault proved decisive. By dropping behind enemy lines, we disrupted their response sufficiently to allow our beach forces to gain foothold. The risk was enormous, but the result vindicated the decision. The success of the Normandy invasion demonstrated principles that remain relevant today. Air superiority enables ground operations. Airborne forces create disproportionate chaos. Overwhelming force applied at decisive points overcomes strong defenses. Most importantly, taking calculated risks can produce strategic results that cautious approaches cannot achieve. For German defenders, the experience was traumatic. Soldiers who survived described the sense of helplessness facing an enemy with such overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, and particularly air power. The psychological impact of watching the sky fill with aircraft and parachutes, of seeing the horizon covered with ships, of enduring bombardment against which there was no effective defense, broke the will of many units. Oberleutnant Weber survived the battle and was captured 3 days later. In his interrogation, he described the moment he saw the sky turning black with aircraft. "I knew then we had lost, not just the battle for the beach, we had lost the battle for France, perhaps the entire situation. No army could stand against such force. The Normandy invasion was not won by heroism alone, though courage was abundant. It was won by overwhelming material superiority, complete air dominance, detailed planning, and the willingness to take risks with airborne operations that could have gone catastrophically wrong. The lessons shaped military operations for generations. Modern military doctrine emphasizes air superiority as prerequisite for ground operations. Airborne and air assault forces remain critical for projecting power rapidly. The principle of concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points, demonstrated at Normandy, influences operational planning today. But the human cost must never be forgotten. Over 10,000 Allied soldiers became casualties on June 6, 1944. Thousands more would perish in the following months of combat in Normandy. German forces lost approximately 9,000 casualties on the first day, with tens of thousands more in subsequent fighting. French civilians caught in combat zones suffered grievously. Liberation came at tremendous price. The veterans who survived carried memories of that day throughout their lives. The paratroopers who jumped into darkness, the soldiers who crossed the beaches under fire, the sailors who brought them there, the pilots who protected them from above. They accomplished something extraordinary, breaking through formidable defenses to begin liberating Europe from occupation. When German troops looked up and saw the sky turning black with Allied aircraft on the night of June 5, 1944, they witnessed the beginning of the end. Not because individual soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because they faced an enemy that had achieved such superiority in industrial capacity, technological capability, and operational planning that the outcome was never truly in doubt. The moment Oberleutnant Weber saw the horizon filling with aircraft, he understood what was coming. The sound of thousands of engines, the sight of endless parachutes descending, the realization that the Allies had assembled a force so vast it defied comprehension. That moment, repeated at hundreds of locations across Normandy, marked the turning point of the Western Front. 75 years later, historians analyzing Operation Overlord consistently identify Allied air supremacy and the airborne assault as decisive factors. The beaches could have been fortified more heavily, the defenders could have been more numerous, the response could have been faster, but without the ability to contest Allied air dominance and without the capability to prevent airborne forces from disrupting responses, no defensive plan could have succeeded. The sky turned black over Normandy on June 25, 1944. When dawn came on June 6th, the course of history had changed. The fortress Europe that Germany had built over 4 years of occupation was breached. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. And it started because Allied commanders were willing to darken the sky with aircraft and fill it with paratroopers, creating chaos that enabled the largest amphibious invasion in history to succeed against formidable defenses. What seemed impossible became inevitable. What defenders feared most came true. The sky itself became a weapon, delivering soldiers behind enemy lines while simultaneously denying the enemy the ability to maneuver. This combination of airborne assault and air supremacy created conditions for victory that ground forces alone could never have achieved. The lesson remains valid today. Control the air, and you control the battle.